Led Zeppelin's third studio album, released only 2 years since their inception, represents a significant step in the evolution of the band, featuring a greater range of instrumentation and eventually venturing out of the traditional studio environment and shaking up their creative approach. It represents the realisation of the creative control they insisted on since the beginning. Their first 2 albums, both released the year prior, had established the successful formula of hard rock. This was epitomised by the driving blues of Whole Lotta Love, the massive hit single that pushed Led Zeppelin 2 to platinum status. However, as the band took a well-deserved break from touring, they knew it was time to push their creative boundaries. Page remarked, "People said we'd blown it not coming up with another album like the second one. But in some ways, the third album was the real beginning of the band," and Plant said, "When we made Led Zeppelin 3, we achieved 2 things. We became the band that wasn't going away, and a band who were never going to repeat themselves." The initial recording sessions took place at Olympic Studios in November 1969. The band were already familiar with Olympic, having recorded their first album there. The original plan was to simply record and release a single, although this plan was abandoned, in favour of concentrating on an album, as was their normal policy. The song in question, Immigrant Song, was actually released later, becoming a hit, and became the album's driving opener. Plant recalls its inception. "We weren't being pompous. We did come from the land of the ice and snow. We were guests of the Icelandic government on a cultural mission. We were invited to play a concert in Reykjavik, and the day before we arrived, all the civil servants went on strike and the gig was going to be cancelled. The university prepared a concert hall for us, and it was phenomenal. The response from the kids was remarkable, and we had a great time. Immigrant Song was about the trip, and it was the opening track on the album that was intended to be incredibly different." May 1970 saw the band take a well-earned break from extensive touring, and it was an opportunity for Page and Plant to take a holiday together. Jimmy remembers, "We'd been working solidly, and I thought it was time for a break, or at least some time to get away from the road. Robert suggested going to this cottage in South Wales that he'd once been to with his parents when he was much younger. He was going on about what a beautiful place it was, and I became pretty keen to go there. So off we went, taking along our guitars of course. It wasn't a question of let's go and knock a few songs out in the country. It was more of a case of getting away for a bit. As the nights wore on, the guitars came out, and the numbers began to be written." Page and Plant withdrew to the remote Welsh cottage Bron-Yr-Aur, where the absence of electricity and running water provided the ideal distraction from the outside world. The song that perfectly captured the laid-back vibe was That's the Way. Born from an afternoon walk that Page and Plant took through the nearby hills, as Robert paused to roll a joint, Jimmy, who had his guitar slung over his back, started strumming some chords, riffing off a traditional folk tune called The Wagoner's Lad. Robert sang along, and within minutes they'd worked out an arrangement they initially called The Boy Next Door, later renamed That's the Way. They recorded their new creation on a cassette recorder pulled from a knapsack, then celebrated with some cake. For the next part of the album's recording, they headed off to Hampshire and to an old manor house named Headley Grange. While traditional studios still had their place, a lot of the bands at this point became dissatisfied with the rigidity of the setup, and some, like the Rolling Stones, decided to set up a way to record in locations of their choosing, with the band setting up a mobile recording studio based around a BMC truck that contained a 16-track self-contained studio. This innovative solution was developed in conjunction with Helios Electronics, with Glyn Johns also contributing to the idea of the layout and the function. The Helios-based preamp served as the front end to the desk, with the system also containing dedicated Helios compressors and popular Compex compressors. Uri 1176 compressors were also available in the truck. It was engineer Andy Johns that suggested to Jimmy that it might be worth checking out the Rolling Stones setup and hiring this truck and Mick Jagger's mansion. Andy remembers, "I mentioned to Jimmy, look, we should use the truck, and he said, okay, how much does that cost? Well, the truck's about £1,000 a week, and so's Mick's house." Page replied, "I'm not giving Mick Jagger £1,000 for some old mansion. I'll find somewhere else." They did find somewhere else, namely Headley Grange, an old country house in Hampshire. It was cheaper as Jimmy had planned, but it was also a bit run down with damp and heating issues. But in order to appease the band, Jimmy at least volunteered to take the worst bedroom. The main idea was to record without distraction or daily schedule, and for everybody to be present in case of a spark of creativity was lit, and they could all join in and take advantage. The truck was parked in front of the house, and they piled wires through the windows of the drawing room, which would be the main recording space for the album. Andy Johns recalls, "They were all in the same living room space, and they would play pretty bloody loud. The sound level would build up tremendously. With no real local pub to disappear to, they instead relied on the local village shop, and opened an account to fill up on large quantities of cider." Jimmy's main guitars for the record was 59 Les Paul and Fender Telecaster nicknamed the Dragon. For acoustics, he had his Harmony Sovereign H1260 heard prominently on Tangerine and his Martin D28. Around this time, Jimmy's main stage amps was a modded Marshall SLP 1959 100-watt amp, but he actually tended to rely on his modded high-watt D103, a much smaller and also modded Super Coronado 1690T. In fact, one of the best tones on the record, which was put down in the studio later on in an overdub session, was Jimmy's solo on Since I've Been Loving You, which came about after Jimmy left the main studio live room in frustration at not getting a decent tone through his Marshall. Apparently there in the corridor was another band's small low-watt amp. Inspiration struck, as according to engineer Terry Manning, he took it into the studio without adjusting any knobs, plugged it in and played it in one take. Another key instrument Page used was the MSA 10-string pedal steel guitar on Tangerine. It's also worth noting his effects, which were the Roger Mayer Fuzzbox, the Solar Sound Tone Bender, Vox Crybaby Wah, modified by Roger Mayer, and the Maestro Echoplex. John Paul Jones' setup for the album was his 1962 Fender Jazz bass into an acoustic 360 bass head paired with a 361 cabinet. He was required to play much more than bass on this album though, taking care of Hammond organ, mandolin and Moog synthesizer on Friends and Celebration Day. Celebration Day also opens with Jones's incredible slide riff. He was so busy in fact, that Page actually ended up putting the bass down for That's the Way. Johns remembers using a few different microphones on the amps that were banged up against the speaker. These included the Neumann U67, a Bayer M160, an AKG D25 and AKG D12. John Bonham played his Ludwig Green Sparkle kit for the session, mic'd up usually with just 3 main mics, one near the kick and 2 above the kit, in a familiar Glyn Johns setup. The mics were likely an AKG D30 for the kick and Neumann KM84s as overheads. When Terry Manning was setting up an overdub session at Ardent, they automatically started close micing his kit. Bonham came in and told him he wasn't having any of it. Manning informed Bonham that it would be good in order to balance the volume of the kit, to which Bonham replied, I think that's my job. As with the previous albums, the band were definitely more than inspired by their influences. Although they normally took from old blues numbers, Since I've Been Loving You borrows heavily from Moby Grape's song Never. With the band required to go back on the road, they had to temporarily leave the album project incomplete. That was until Jimmy got in touch with old friend Terry Manning, who worked at Ardent Studios in Memphis, who he asked to assist in completing everything with overdubs followed by mixing and mastering. Back then, with no automation, a mixing session was a performance, so panning and volume levels were adjusted in real time as the multitracks were fed into the stereo master tape. Terry said, Jimmy had his hands right on the console as well, and we planned out what we were going to do, so it was all hands on deck there. I think once, even Peter Grant, their manager, had to get in the middle and push a fader. Out on the tiles, there's a very long fade out, with tom rolls all the time. We didn't have stereo drums, but we wanted to give a bit of a stereo effect. So on the tom rolls, just as John Bonham finishes hitting the snare and was about to hit the tom, I would take the pan pot and jab it over to the left, and then when he played the tom roll, I would roll it to the right. Just before the next snare came in, I would be sure to put it right back in the centre. But on one of the times, I missed it, and the snare comes in over on the right quite a bit more than it should do. Every time I hear that, I just laugh. Terry remembers how Page loved to embrace happy accidents. One such occasion is the first thing you hear on the record. The tape noise that precedes the Immigrant song wasn't seen as a hindrance and removed, but instead fed through an echoplex and repeated a few times for good measure. Another occasion was the segue between Friends and Celebration Day, as the drums at the beginning of Celebration Day were accidentally erased. Instead of re-recording the drums though, they went with it and created the synth drone to cover it up. The album's release was hugely anticipated, with pre-orders of over 1 million records. The new direction was mainly well received, but some critics bemoaned the lack of a new Whole Lot of Love, with the second side of the album being almost exclusively acoustic. Andy Johns recalled, there'd been a bit of a backlash about the Zepp 3 album, being more of an acoustic type thing. The album sold well, but there were some complaints about what had happened to Led Zeppelin, like where's the meat? Today, it holds up as one of their best works, and a key shift in their sound, so not only is it a great album, but an important part in the Led Zeppelin story.